So what we've heard about so far is how to get a license, and then we've heard Adam tell us what we need to do once we've got the license. And what I'm going to talk about is what may be happening next. So as Adam mentioned there, expect a regulatory blizzard for the next 24 months. And what we're going to look at very, very quickly, actually, because we've only got 20 minutes, is what might be in that blizzard. So we'll get right on with that. So global regulatory trends and initiatives. So what are the current trends and where have those trends come from? And that's what really we're going to look at first of all. So I think the first thing that's driving regulators globally is the shock still from the collapse of Lehman's and from the sale of all those very, very horrible AAA mortgage-backed securities in the US predominantly. But of course those AAA asset-backed securities weren't just sold in the US, they were sold all over the world, predominantly via the US, but they were actually sold in Malta too, as some of you will know, and they were sold all over the EU. They were sold to private investors, and they were sold to pension funds, and they were sold to university endowments, etc. And in the end, they were mostly of no value whatsoever. So that is driving policymakers. And if you listen to the rhetoric coming out of the US Senate and Congress, but also out of the European Parliament and also out of national parliaments, the rhetoric is very much driven by the desire of policymakers to avoid these situations again in the future, where you've got people who are perceived to be dishonest, basically, as it says there, perception of opaque, or in some cases deliberately deceitful marketing materials, trying to present products to be actually things than other than what in fact they are. So that, I think, there are probably 20 odd, if not even more, different drivers to what's going on a global basis. But I think the key drivers to what's going on with regards policymakers at the supranational level, the G20, the OECD, which we'll see in a minute, are these desires, which are perfectly well-placed desires. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this from a policymaker's point of view. I mean, in most cases, most of the G20 leaders are elected leaders. Some of them aren't, but most of them are elected leaders. And quite legitimately, they have the responsibility to try and protect the general public from being ripped off by dishonest financial advisors at the end of the day. This is a quote. The global financial crisis has highlighted the need for more effective financial consumer protection measures as consumers face more sophisticated and complex financial markets, which we'll go on to talk about in a moment. The availability of information has grown both in quantity and complexity, and the pace of change in terms of new product developments, product innovations, technological advances has increased dramatically. So if we sort of go back, cast our minds back sort of 25, 30 years ago, you'd got an environment where you could buy an equity fund, you could buy a bond fund, you could buy a property fund. Nobody had ever heard of a derivative really, certainly from the client point of view, nobody knew what a derivative was. It was something of an innovation if you actually had a fund. Somebody came up with the concept of managed funds, and those are the marvellous things, actually had equities, bonds and property at the same time. And that was really an innovation 30, 40 years ago. And then you've gone on from there, and really every 12 months something new comes out. You've now got this fund that's got swaps in it, and you've got a fund that's got FDIs in it, and you've got all sorts of things going on. You've got people doing CFDs and funds, you've got people doing FX and funds, and basically what we're expecting the clients to do actually is to keep up with this, when it's often difficult even for us to keep up with this, and actually understand what we're trying to sell to them. And what the policymakers are saying is, maybe we need to slow down a little bit, or maybe we need to explain things a little bit better and invest a little bit more time in client education rather than just trying to flog these products off to people, basically. This was the G20 communique, which I think came out in early last year. This was the high-level principles of financial consumer protection, and the actual document was published, as it says there, in October 2011. Now this, of course, is supported both by the G20 and, of course, by the OECD as well. So what's all this about? The high-level principles are designed to assist G20 countries and other interested economies to enhance financial consumer protection. The principles complement and do not substitute any existing international principles. So basically what they're trying to say here is, what they're not doing here is introducing rules for people to follow. They're leaving that to the national parliaments, the EU Parliament in the EU's case, and the national regulators. What they're not trying to do is make prescriptive rules. What they're trying to do is set out a range of principles which they would hope, and believe me, when these people hope something, it tends to happen, because they're all sort of all-powerful. And regulation as well, we've got to bear in mind, it's not a bottom-up process, is it? It's very much a top-down process. So what happens is policymakers decide that something is in the interests of various groups of people, and then of course they then go to the national parliaments, and the national parliaments go to the regulators, and the regulators may have some tactical control over what goes on, but in terms of strategy, of course, the whole thing is being driven from a top-down basis. So what is the top-down basis? So the new policy and regulatory focus on financial consumer protection results, amongst other things, from the increased transfer of opportunities and risks to individuals and households. So basically what they're harping back to here is, and it's interesting of course that they actually use that term, transfer of opportunities and risks, rather than just transfer of risks. Because what they're not saying is, don't sell securitised mortgage bonds to the general public. They're not actually saying that, are they? They're actually saying that could be an opportunity as well as a risk. So it may have a very, very high yield. That high yield may be very, very attractive to a particular investor under a particular set of circumstances. But what they're saying is, be honest with the underlying investor about what is in the securitised investment that you are trying to sell to. So don't try and present it as a AAA, nothing can ever go wrong with this, it's as safe as a government bond, when it isn't. That's what the message is from the G20. And they do note as well at the bottom there that the level of financial literacy remains low in a number of jurisdictions. Now I was talking to a guy who, I lent a villa in Caparra, and the guy I lent it off had his 50th wedding anniversary, and he invited me to go along to that, which was very nice of him. Lovely guy. And his wife's brother came over, who lives in Florida, and he stayed basically underneath in a little flat. And I got talking to the guy, and he was a very, very pleasant chap. And I drove him down there because he didn't have a car and he didn't know where Marshall Lock was. So I said, well, that's okay, I'll sort of drive you down. And we got talking. And for the living, the guy's the most interesting profession actually. What he does is he arranges the repatriation of dead people who've died while on holiday, and that's actually what his job is. So basically, if you go on holiday and die, and you need to get your body back to, in his case, Florida, what he does is he organises that, and that's his job, which I thought, well, that's fantastic, because I never really thought about that before, but what an interesting job. He said, but I don't use a financial advisor. He said, I don't use anybody like you. I don't really trust you guys. So that's, here you are, sat in my car, driving me to Marshall. No, he said, you can't be trusted, not at all. He says, I do all my own investments. I said, well, what do you invest in? He said, I like covered calls. And I thought, you're a very interesting private investor. So the guy actually writes covered calls as his investment strategy, and he's a private investor, and he's not industry. So the level of investor literacy, the level of investor sophistication, can you imagine a Maltese client saying to you, yes, I'll do it myself, I'm going to write some covered calls? I mean, it's just not going to happen at all. So what they're trying to say here is that the level of investor sophistication is very different in different jurisdictions. And what you'll find is in the US, particularly in Canada, you've got a very, very high level of investor sophistication. People will actually, on their own behest, go on the internet and invest in derivatives through brokerage accounts. And then you'll find other jurisdictions like the UK where some people will do that now and again. I mean, I know a few people who do buy derivatives using brokerage accounts who aren't in the industry. But when it comes to places I would suggest like Malta, it's going to be almost nobody is going to go and open a brokerage account on the internet and start trading derivatives. I'm not saying nobody, but not many people are going to do that. It's not going to be that common. So we have to recognise that the level of sophistication is different in different jurisdictions.